Welcome to the Real Paranormal Stories podcast with your host, Christopher Buckner. Send your stories to realparanormalstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Royalty-free music provided by Kevin MacLeod and Tabletop Audio. And now, let's take a trip into the paranormal. This story comes from someone who wanted to remain anonymous. And this is their story. It was late August of 1981, and I was 19 and still living at home with my dad and his second wife, along with my two other sisters and one of my brothers. We girls had the bigger room that had a bunk bed and a single bed set up in it. My 6-year-old sister slept on the bottom bunk, and my 17-year-old sister slept on the top bunk, leaving the single twin bed for me. And I always had a little nightstand I kept snug up against my bed, so my glasses wouldn't fall between the bed and the nightstand. We slept with the door to our bedroom closed for privacy. An important note is I had learned I was 4 months pregnant a few days prior to this event. It was near 11 o'clock or so, and all of us girls were in bed for the night. I was reading, and I thought both sisters were asleep. I'm not sure why I looked up from my book, but when I did, I saw what looked like a child, very young, about 4 to 5 years old, just standing in the open doorway. A few things here were out of place. Our dad always shut our bedroom door after he came in and said goodnight, and the youngest person in our home was, I thought, asleep across the room from me. I kept looking at the child as I fumbled to get my glasses. Once I had them on, I could see the child was a little boy wearing unbuttoned knickers, stockings, and a white shirt with no collar. I couldn't see his feet from where I was sitting. He was just standing there, looking into our room. I asked if he was lost. We lived on the bottom floor of a 3-story apartment building. "Where are your parents, honey?" He turned towards me and walked across the floor to the end of my bed, continued walking along the side of my bed, and between my bed and nightstand to the bay windows at the front of our room. He stared out the window for a few moments, and then he was just gone. That's when I heard a very soft and drawn-out "wow" from over by the bunk beds. It was my baby sister. I asked if she had seen what I did. She said, "The little boy just disappeared." Then she asked, "How did he get by your table?" If you remember in my earlier description, I told you I had that table snug tight against my bed, so my glasses didn't fall between the bed and the table. There was no room for anyone to walk between them. We got up and ran to our dad to tell him, and after we went through the doorway, we realized at the same time that we had to open the door because it was closed like my dad had done hours before. Our dad didn't believe us. He said we had to have been dreaming. He asked what book I was reading, and had I been reading it to my sister. Maybe it was our imaginations caught up in the story. I hadn't been reading it to her, and even if I had, it was, "Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret." His response was, "Maybe it's your hormones." I just gave him a blank stare and thought to myself, Sienna, name changed to protect her, doesn't have pregnancy hormones. She's 6. She and I went back to bed frustrated that our parents didn't believe us. I remember we tried to stay awake to see if he came back that night, but we drifted off because we both woke to the morning alarm clock. The next night, though, about 11, it started all over again. he just appeared at our door, which was open again. He did the exact same thing he did the last time. Walked across the room, up my bedside between the table and bed, and stood at the bay window looking out, and then he was gone. I looked over to see if Sienna had seen him, and she was sitting up in her bed with wide eyes, looking towards the window and then to me. Did we imagine him again? I shook my head no. The next morning at breakfast, Sienna blurted out that the little boy came back last night and did exactly what he did the night before. My stepmom was upset because she thought my, as she put it, obsession with ghost stories was putting thoughts in her daughter's head. I looked to my dad for help and knew he wasn't getting in the middle of us, so I snapped back that I don't talk about those things around Sienna because she, stepmom, asked me not to. I only read tame books around Sienna. We know what we saw and we're telling the truth. So our dad said, fine. Tonight I will sit with you girls to see if it happens again, okay? We both nodded emphatically, yes. That night our dad came in and sat on my bed with Sienna on his lap, and I was snuggled up on his arm as he read Alice in Wonderland to us. Sienna started tapping our dad's arm. It's almost 11. The lamp on my table shut off. Then I saw him. He went through his whole routine again. We watched our dad this time. We know he saw him because his head moved as he watched the little boy. And when he vanished, even in the paleness of the room, we saw the color drain from our dad's face. Sienna and I said in unison, "You saw him!" Dad said he didn't see anything. He cleared his throat and said he didn't want to hear any more about it, and I was to stop filling Sienna's head with nonsense. After he left the room and shut the door behind him, I screamed into my pillow. Sienna gave me a hug and said she saw him and she knows he is real. We went to sleep shortly after. The fourth night was the last night we saw the little boy. He went through his whole routine with one exception. Instead of vanishing out the window, he turned and looked right at me and said, "I like you. You're kind." Then he vanished. We never saw him appear in our room again after that night. But as the years have passed, I have realized he isn't gone. He makes himself known just when I least expect him. This may sound like a story you tell around a campfire, but it's all true and accurate. It's been over 40 years since he first appeared in our bedroom, and there are more stories involving the little boy, including some research I did about the area we lived in when he first showed up, and having his voice come across as an EVP. And that is their story. This story comes from a Reddit user who wanted to remain anonymous. And this is their story. I came home to my 5-bedroom house at around 7:30 p.m. I walked down the long hall where most of the bedrooms were to put my clothes in the laundry. At the end of the hall, I could see a blue light from a computer screen. Before going into the laundry, I poked my head into the end room and saw what I assumed was my father-in-law sitting at the computer desk, that blue light shining on his bald head. I grunted hello and went into the adjacent laundry. While I was putting my clothes into the washer, I realized that my father-in-law wasn't even in the country. He lived overseas and would visit. I was home alone in the laundry at the far end of the house, and I had definitely seen something sitting in the next room that should not have been there. After panicking for a few minutes, I gathered up the courage to flick on as many lights as I could and look into the room. Nothing was there. The room was empty. The blue light was gone and the computer was completely off. I had a few other encounters in that house and learned after living there for several years that the previous owner's son had died of cancer while living there. And that is their story. That's all for this episode of the Real Paranormal Stories podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review anywhere this podcast can be found.